Welcome to the IT Matters Podcast, where we explore why IT matters and matters pertaining to IT.
Welcome back to the IT Matters Podcast. We are on lucky number 13. It is episode 13 today. Thank you for listening. Remember to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Although I did just find out Stitcher is no longer going to be a platform. So if you are listening on Stitcher, switch to Apple or Spotify or something else and subscribe to us. So excited to have you on for an episode that we have not really done in the past before. We're excited to do this. It's going to be a little bit more of a focus on a specific technology. Today, we're going to be talking with Jason Christopher from Dragos, which is a focused OT technology security company. And we're going to talk about all things OT security, what it means, why people use it, etc. Keith Hawkey, my co-host, welcome. Keith, how you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing fantastic, Aaron. Thanks for asking.
So what's new in the world of IT and what's new in the world of Keith?
What's new in the world of Keith is reading an article on Computer World. The title is Makers of ChatGPT have announced the company's dedicating 20% of its compute processing power over the next 4 years to stop super intelligent AI from quote unquote going rogue. And I'm wondering, is 20% enough? I don't think so.
20% a lot to, I guess, prevent your own technology. And if you had to spend that on employees from going rogue. So that seems like a lot, but I know it's a serious issue that we're hearing in the news. I mean, I saw, I forget what it was, and I'm going to get some of the details butchered, but I saw something recently. Maybe Keith, you shared this. A lawyer was too lazy to process his own casework, and it was he was looking for case precedents for one of his cases that he had. And so he used either ChatGPT or Bard, I don't know which one, gave him a bunch of case precedents, and they all turned out to be completely made up. So not one was actually true. So our friend of AI and our ChatGPT bot completely made up the case. The lawyer is going to lose his license. He's going to lose his practice, and the AI went rogue. So be wary. Be wary if you're using AI to do all of your work and not fact checking it somehow. But I do think it's an interesting debate that's happening, and we'll see where this goes. 20% is a lot, though.
It's not enough, Aaron. It's not enough. It won't save us from the Terminator.
All right, if you say so.
But yeah, so that brings us to Jason and Dragos. So first of all, Jason, thanks for hopping on. And today we have a special guest. Jason, you have a background in IT and OT cybersecurity, and you are currently the director of cyber risk at Dragos, leading their OT cybersecurity organization. Besides the cool name of Dragos, which was founded in 2016, Dragos has taken it upon themselves to blend technology, intelligence, and people to provide a layer of security to operational technology. So, Jason, why don't you introduce yourself and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I'm the director of cyber risk at Dragos. What we do is a conversation, as you sort of already laid up for me, on how can you start implementing and having a true detection program within your OT environment. When we talk about OT, and I should probably spend a little bit of time on that just because I know a lot of folks aren't familiar with the concepts. So IT, information technology, OT, operational technology. And when we think about operational technology, these are things that the zeros and ones aren't the data that we use to store sensitive information, right? If we're in the banking sector, we have zeros and ones that may be customer data, financial data. When we think of the zeros and ones in operational technology, those are actually opening a lever, turning a valve, flow of molecules, flow of electrons. Those are the things that we're dealing with in OT. So the zeros and ones become a thing that interact with the physical world, which is a little bit different. And because of that, the technologies are all over the place. Instead of maybe having a, laptop that we're going to refresh every 3 to 4 years like we would in IT, we've got equipment that's going to last for 30 to 40 years in OT. So talking about things like, hey, how are we going to patch this device that's still running Windows XP is a totally different conversation in the OT space, where we'd actually have to bring a plant down in some cases to be able to do that. So the security constraints are very different. The technologies that we use to be able to secure those systems are very, very different. And the impacts are different. If I'm dealing with an incident in IT, I may be looking at system downtime, maybe things like ransomware that could be able to lock my systems up. In OT, I may very extremely have a hole in the ground, right? I may deal with loss of safety, loss of human life, impacts to community, environmental impacts, and things of that nature. So just everything about it. It looks similar on the surface, right? I still have networks. I still have routers. I have switches. But everything sort of in the guts of the situation is going to be a little bit different.
Yeah, Jason, it's interesting. And I want to get into this a little bit more. You talk a lot about the importance of OT security. And I think what we need to do is go back and, like you said, define OT. There's the OT and the IT. Where we're at today, I know it, but I know some of our listeners may not know. I want to kind of go back into like the largest OT breach to date and like how it happened, et cetera. But I also wanted to share previously on the IT Matters podcast, we actually had a guest, Scott Thinkhouse, talking about like an OT related issue. And it's really interesting from a security perspective. You mentioned patching like a really old Windows XP device, right? It's not so easy. Like in IT, we just think, well, yeah, you're really behind on your patching. Like that's inexcusable. In OT, I think what people don't realize is you spend 10, 15, 20, $30 million on a machine that runs a really core process in your plant. It's not so easy just to patch that thing that's going to break that whole machine. And now you got to spend that 30 million. So it's kind of got this very financially business driven use case over here, but a real live security issue over here. And I think there's a lot of people saying, well, like, geez, we've always kind of looked at these as two separate, almost parts of the business, but you can't anymore. So I wanted to bring that up, but also, can you talk about, like, I think we all know what it is, but share with you, in your opinion, what has been the largest OT breach to date and what happened?
So for me, the one that always stands up, and unfortunately it's still an ever evolving issue, is what took place in the Ukraine from 2015 and 2016. Those ones in particular stand out to me because we were talking about it for a while, like, hey, this could happen. The electric grid has some vulnerabilities. If there was a dedicated actor, we could have outages that could impact whole communities. And then the 2015 cyber attacks happened in Ukraine, which brought down about 250,000 folks without power for roughly anywhere between 4 to 6 hours, depending on where you're counting on the event timeline. And then it evolved into the following year in 2016 with a sort of Swiss Army knife of OT malware, a framework of OT malware that we hadn't seen before called crash override. And seeing an adversary start investing more and more in automating their attack flows, which is something in IT we see all the time. Seeing that evolution in OT became pretty concerning. The other one that I would say is extremely concerning would be the Trisis attack. Trisis, if we think about the two different systems that I'm concerned about most when I walk into a plant, one is the control system. That is what is allowing an operator to, again, turn a valve, open a lever, things of that nature. The other is the safety system. The safety system allows me as an engineer to walk on site and understand that I will maintain my eyesight, my limbs, and my life at the end of the day, because there are going to be these passive safety elements or controlled safety elements that if something bad were to happen, at least you'd still be alive. And the attacker, instead of going after the control system, which is what took place in the Ukraine events, went after the safety systems. So that tells you deliberately they were trying to kill people. And those two things, if I were to look at those sort of evolution of events between Ukraine and the Trisis event, those are the two that always stand out in my mind as really seeing the ante being upped by the attackers to really do damage.
Got it. Yeah, and Keith, I don't want to pass this over to you in just a second, but you mentioned Ukraine in 2015-16, which is crazy. That's 8 years ago. We're talking about breaches. I mean, Trisis, you didn't even mention Colonial Pipeline, which is another big one. How has OT security and how has OT security systems evolved over the last, say, 5 to 10 years in your mind?
Yeah, and actually, Colonial Pipeline is interesting because that was very much so an IT-centric attack. It was a controlled shutdown. And that's one thing where, if you want to talk about the evolution, I think is interesting. We talk a lot about convergence. And convergence of technology is somewhat taking place, right? If I walk into a plant, I'll see computers, I'll see assets that look IT-like, but they're OT because they impact operations. For Colonial Pipeline, it was the system that allows you to understand what product is in the pipeline. So when that was part of the ransomware impacts, you had no idea if there was jet fuel in that pipeline or premium gasoline. And you don't want to mix the two up, right? You don't want to try to fly a plane on premium gasoline. Likewise, I don't want to fill my car up with jet fuel. And because they could not understand that, because they couldn't have that visibility on the IT side, OT had to shut down in terms of being able to make sure that, hey, if we can't understand who's getting what, then we shouldn't be selling it. So that controlled shutdown, I think, is an interesting piece. And that evolution, I think, is where the boundary of IT and OT, that I think is the evolutionary state that we're currently in. Where does it reside? Who manages the firewall for an OT plant? Is it going to be enterprise IT, who understands firewalls really, really well, but may not understand OT protocols, operations, safety? Or is it the folks in the plant who understand those three things very, very well, but may not totally understand like why any is a bad firewall rule to have in place? And so this convergence has happened somewhat with technology, but hasn't happened really with people. Understanding the sort of education that you need on the workforce of both sides to come together to really be able to support that evolution that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm curious at what industries or business segments is Dragos seeing the most growth in, and what has been the catalyst for the adoption for another layer of OT security? Understandably, human life is a catalyst, but what areas are kind of more in the hyper growth mode?
So I feel like it's the same thing in IT, where we talk about, unfortunately, once an event happens, that's when people pay attention. Same thing in OT. So I would say there are two drivers mainly that have been happening, and one is regulation and the other are events. So we see the most growth and probably also the most maturity in the electric sector and the energy sector. Electric sector has had mandatory cybersecurity standards in place that impact OT since 2010. So there's a bit of maturity there that you don't see in other sectors as a result. Same thing with the energy sector, especially things like Colonial Pipeline that forced new regulations coming out of TSA. And that, again, forced a little bit more growth there. What I think is one of the impactful ideas that people need to understand is that, again, I can't put traditional IT controls in those OT environments. Where we talk about the idea of prevention is ideal, detection is a must, really, really strong in OT. When I talk about OT, we talk about the M&M model, and I mean the candy, not the wrapper from Detroit. In the M&M model, it's hard shell GUI.
Both good though. Very
good. Yes, agreed.
Yeah.
And so the hard shell GUI center means I need to invest in my perimeters. I need to invest in firewalls. I need to invest in physical security perimeters. But they're going to fail. Like how many firewalls have you ever worked on that was like totally pristine, didn't have a temporary firewall rule that has now been in place for 10 years? Very, very rare. And so that's where we really lean into detection. That's what Dragos specializes in, looking at detection inside those OT environments, knowing that the perimeters will fail and knowing that we can't put in things like antivirus. You're going to walk into a control center or control room and you go to a device. It's not going to have any idea how to authenticate. Maybe if you're lucky, you can enter a 4-digit PIN. So in those cases, the traditional IT controls won't be in place. So prevention is ideal. Detection is a must. I'd further qualify detection without response is probably a little value, right? Like if I see something on fire, but I don't know how to put out a fire, it's not going to help me out too much. And so that evolution is where I see OT really strengthening, less so in the prevention discussions because we can only do so much, more so in detection and being able to respond to an incident quickly.
So you bring up a really interesting, I think, question. If I'm a CEO, CFO, CIO, I'm a leader in an organization that would have some amount of OT that they need to be concerned about, right? In IT, CIS framework, NIST framework, they're very popular. It's easy. Insurance companies come in, whoever comes in and assesses and says, yeah, meet these controls, right? If you do this, you're 90% of the way to security. What would you advise a new CEO of a manufacturer and they're concerned about, do I have OT security in place? Like, are we doing everything we can? How do they assess that? What's the best way to do it? What are some successful stories? What are some maybe not so successful stories you've seen? And like, what is Dragos? Like, how do you guys approach it?
So we actually approach it using a framework called the 5 critical controls for ICS. 5 critical controls for ICS are just very simple, very easy ways to be able to bucket things. Sort of starting with the idea of incident response and understanding what that means to you. Really, for example, understanding the scenarios that mean the most, not sort of boiling the ocean, but those scenarios that mean the most to you. Do you have the playbooks in place? Do you have the processes in place to respond? And from there, then pivoting to the idea of what is defensible architecture. Defensible architecture for us being based off those scenarios you care about. because again, we can't put in traditional IT controls. So let's say I'm worried about ransomware in my environment. There may be a set of 50 controls or so to help me prevent ransomware in our OT environment. But let's say you're really concerned about Trisis, right? The Trisis event that I talked about earlier, targeting safety events. That may be like 120 different controls. And so understanding your environment, understanding what you care about most is what will then sort of flush out this conversation around our defensible architecture. And so the controls then sort of build themselves upon from there, talking about things like what do we do for secure remote access? What do we do for key vulnerability management? All of them at the end of the day, really trying to supplement and have a big bucket idea of, if I don't know where to start, let me at least start with these 5 critical controls and move from there. There are larger frameworks. So similar to like we have in IT, if you're familiar with the NIST sort of SP 853, we have SP 882. 82 is just an overlay on top of 53 that says, hey, you know what you're not going to be able to do in OT? Multi-factor authentication in the control center. So we allow you to do things like have badge card reader access, count as multi-factor. And so there's a different set of audit techniques that you can do there. I mentioned electric sector. Again, we have mandatory regulations there. Same with energy with TSA. So we do have frameworks in place. We do have standards that are in place. I would say, just like every other IT program that you run into, the risk becomes, is it compliance based? In which case, is it just check the box? Or are you really looking at it from a security perspective? And that's where I challenge CEOs to look at it from that perspective, is saying, hey, what do we care about? Are we doing this safely? Can we maintain reliability even during a cyber event? And those are all conversations that we'd have to have, as opposed to, I do 882 and just call it a day.
Yeah, that reminds me that how important the human element is to securing IT and it sounds like OT as well. You mentioned, a reinvention of how to think about security, your badging in and out. The controls you're able to implement on the IT side are numerous, but it sounds like as far as authenticating and training employees to view their jobs in a different way that bring about security to the organization is a task in and of itself. How does Dragos help the human element side of things if you're leading a team and you're having a conversation with Dragos?
Yeah, so we actually have some complementary services that sort of surround the platform. So the platform, being the detection platform, looks for abnormalities, understands OT specific protocols and sort of how operations should work. So if something, for example, if you're speaking in a certain protocol, let's say if you're in the electric sector, DMP3 is a very popular protocol to be able to operate. All of a sudden you see a device using like an IEC 104 protocol that you don't use at all. That's likely an attacker. Like there's very few reasons that a device that is deterministic would all of a sudden start using a different protocol that it should not understand or know. So we're able to provide that additional conversation about, here's the detection piece. Within the platform also, we have playbooks. So, hey, you just saw this sort of indicator trigger. What should you do? Here's sort of the top things that you should run through. And then we can augment that further. We have training, for example, we have Dragos Academy that allows people to sort of understand OT a little bit better, understand what you should do during an incident. We also have professional services that sort of, again, help augment your team. So if you don't know how to do an architecture review, you're not certain where you should start, those services come into play. And then we also have intelligence. So being able to provide OT specific intelligence, which is very different than IT, right? In IT, there are hundreds, if not thousands of activity groups and things you need to keep on top of. OT, it's a little bit smaller, right? We're talking about dozens of activity groups that understand operations, understand how to attack OT, and providing that very specific information, again, allows you to, what I like to call, patch the human, right? If the human understands the things that are going wrong, then they should be able to build better processes and leverage technology a little bit better as well.
You mentioned earlier, well, you kind of been talking about it throughout and I appreciate you sharing that, because that's really helpful for, I think, the listener to understand, like, kind of framing OT technologies and security. You mentioned highly regulated industries being the first adopters. And I think it makes total sense why, right? Like electric, right. If the electric grid goes down, we're all screwed, i.e. Ukraine, et cetera. Which industry do you think will be the next one to really adopt this technology? That's kind of the first question. Yep. And feel free to kind of get granular, because I think like manufacturing has OT everywhere, but I think there's probably certain manufacturing that's probably more likely to adopt. So that's kind of the first question. So feel free to answer that one. I'm curious what you think on the next industry.
Yeah, the next industry I would support this idea of manufacturing. You're right, though, manufacturing is so broad, right? There are, these Fortune 50 manufacturers. There's also, like, believe it or not, like mom and pop manufacturers, right? Where they're local community driven. And maybe they don't understand sort of what those impacts could possibly look like. So I see it probably going more towards the more mature manufacturers. And I'd also include sectors like chemical sector into that too. Chemical sector has hit the accelerator, same with pharmaceuticals, on more digital transformation. And that means that we're seeing cloud connectivity to OT systems, persistent cloud connectivity, which should frighten a lot of people. We're seeing, I've walked into some facilities where they're managing some of the things on iPads, which looks really cool. But again, from an attack surface, is probably adding a lot more that you want to be able to detect. So seeing manufacturing, chemical, you sort of move in that direction, I'd say would be next. The one underlier, the one that I'm uncertain about, just because I think budgeting is hard for them, is water sector. We've seen events, right, that have sort of grabbed national attention. Water is as vital as power, right? Like I want to be able to have safe drinking water, but there are 50,000 water utilities ish around about in the United States alone. And they're very small in some cases. The profit margins on those, they don't drive by profit. They drive by serving a community. And so it's relatively cheap commodity, which means that there may not be a budget at all for somebody who's doing OT. As a matter of fact, their OT person could just be the operator. It could be the IT person who doesn't understand OT. And so there's a lot of constraints there. I would love to see water mature. I just don't know where that sort of incentive or funding would come from for a lot of the smaller utilities.
So let's go back to the question around it. Earlier, you answered, where is OT security and kind of high level, what is it? Now I guess from Dragos' perspective and what you talk to customers every day, Dragos is obviously an advanced OT security and helps companies mature their OT security practice. Like if I'm a CEO and I'm walking in, I'm taking a new role in a manufacturer or in a utility company, and I'm kind of questioning, like, do we have any security? Like, what are you typically seeing? What are you replacing? Like, where are people in the spectrum of OT security, and how bad can it be?
So what is typically interesting for either new CEOs or even new board members, right? Because now boards, especially if you look at things here in the States, like the new SEC guidance is coming out saying, hey, you have to have a board member who understands cyber risk. They'll look at their budgets and say, well, we're spending in cybersecurity. And so they'll talk to the CISO, and the CISO will talk about, the scorecards they have and all the things that they're doing for, phishing and being able to look from the outside in, inside out, all those good things. But the CISO rarely has any visibility into OT security. That may be managed by the plant manager. That could be managed by the VP engineering. And if you ask that person what's been their budget for cybersecurity, it's very small, if anything. And the first time CEO or first time board members, the things about them is that they typically understand operations, right? The CEO probably came from the plant floor, came from the utility and worked their way up. When they say, wait, you mean the thing that we produce, the thing that like provides power to a community or that we are actually producing as a manufacturer has no security on it, but our IT enterprise stuff is really secure? That becomes a culture shock because they look at the money they've been spending and not understanding that it doesn't cover OT maybe at all. And so for some people, it's their first time ever for them to invest in OT, and they put everything into IT, not realizing there's supposed to be a mix, not realizing there's differences in technology or protections. And that is where, unfortunately, I see a lot of folks, if they're just starting out on this journey, they get sticker shock from the perspective of, I've already spent money. What do you mean I didn't do anything? That's a scary prospect for some people.
Jason, can you give an example of it could be a basic one, like where's Dragos thwarted an attack? Like what was the attack that came in? Mm-hmm. Like how did it stop it? Like what's a common one that you see like every day?
Right. So, there are the cool, sexy things that I could talk about, but I could also talk about the really mundane. And
well, let's start with mundane, then you can get really sexy if you want.
Yeah, because the mundane stuff, like frankly, when an IT person comes into a plant, and we could talk about some things that could get detected, we can find things like common IT commodity malware from like the 2000s, right? I'm talking like Configure, Code Red, Slammer. And it could be propagating throughout the network of a generation plant or a facility. And the traditional IT response will be knee jerk. I need to be able to quarantine that. I need to be able to wipe that machine, but that machine may be doing operations. And so what we'd actually talk to them about is actually, you should just leave that running. If it's not impacting operations, leave it running. I understand configures, like it's a nuisance. It's not really, that great, but it doesn't know OT. It doesn't know how to bring down the plant. It would, like, the probability of it doing so is so minimal. It's clogging up some traffic, clogging up some resources. But if everything's fine, let's worry about it in the next maintenance cycle, which may be 3 months from now. And so again, from a detection platform perspective, finding the mundane is just as important as sort of the cool, intricate things. And those mundane things are happening more often than not. It doesn't mean it's not a good day. Like, you still talk to an operator, be like, so did you plug in a USB that you shouldn't have? Like, there's still like an investigation. There's, like, I don't want to undercut that this is not a, no worry situation. Somebody did something they shouldn't have, but it's not bring down the plant, which could be $50,000 per day of, product that could be leveraged in your organization. So the mundane is, pretty mundane. I would say that the more escalated things are when you're able to sort of see, and what we do are called threat hunts. We actually build out hypotheses for what would you do if you were an adversary, and being able to understand and see that, and in particular, those boundaries between IT and OT. Similar to what I talked about with Colonial Pipeline, right? It wasn't really an OT attack. It was an IT attack, but crossing those boundaries is really important. And being able to detect, any sort of activity there, I would say, is where things get escalated and get a little bit more interesting.
Yeah. Speaking about crossing the boundaries between OT and IT, I'm curious, how does cloud enter the conversation here? How many processes have the OT side of the business offloaded to a public or private cloud? And what are the implications when it comes to security, and how does Dragos tackle that conversation?
Yeah. So the cloud, thankfully, in a lot of areas, like, for example, the highly regulated areas, off limits, right? If you're an electric utility, you're not putting any operations in the cloud in North America. But like I said before, I've gone to chemical facilities where, and they're real conversations, because you could talk about real cost savings. If you, were to implement this cloud solution, not only are we monitoring your fleet, but the worldwide fleet of all the things that we as a vendor can see, we could save you maybe millions of dollars in efficiency if you just install this one cloud solution. What we recommend there is having a dedicated DMZ, dedicated demilitarized zone, just for the cloud, and have monitoring on that, right? Being able to say it's not persistent. We're going to make sure that we're detecting the things that we need to detect, but don't muddy it up with, like, the way I connect to the enterprise IT. Like, have something dedicated just for that solution, because we're in the wild, wild west when it comes to the cloud and in OT. We need to be able to monitor a lot more than we currently are.
What are some ways for, let's say we have a CEO listening to our podcast, what are some questions that he should ask his organization to assess the use case for introducing a conversation with Dragos? Who should he consult and speak with? What questions should he ask?
Yep.
How does he start?
Yeah.
Or so he or she begin.
So I could start it off as a very simple one of sitting down with the folks in your plant and asking them, what does a bad day really look like? They already know from an operational perspective. They're like, oh, if that turbine over there starts making this humming noise, like, run for the hills. But they probably never looked at it from a cybersecurity perspective before. And so having a security person with them to understand, could we do that from cyber means? That starts the conversation. The next piece that I would then ask is, how do we know? When we talk about a, event in OT, it's not going to be the classic 1995 film, The Hackers. I'm not going to have a virus singing row, row, row your boat while it's capsizing ships. I've never seen an adversary put that much dedication into writing malware. What you will see, and what it will feel like, is a maintenance event, right? The controller over there no longer operates. It's not communicating to the main HMI, human machine interface, where the operator is actually working with a thing. And so if it looks and feels like a maintenance event, when would you ever know it's a cyber event? And what CEOs find jaw dropping for those aspects is, we would never know. And so that's where the idea of Dragos as a detection platform come in, because we'll be able to tell you, yeah, that's actually a maintenance event. No, this one actually looks like activity. You need to be able to do an incident response and recovery plan ASAP to be able to bring you back to a safe state. And so those two questions, what my bad day looks like and how would I know, would be the two that I would give any CEO to start off with.
Switching gears a little bit. So we've talked a lot about here IT versus OT. I want to really muddy the waters. IoT. So an IoT is popping up. Let's go 5G, and I can't listen to a podcast now on any podcast, like some form of 5G IoT is now coming in. Like last night I was listening to a podcast and it was like, you tired of your podcast dropping? Get T-Mobile because our 5G network, blah, blah, blah. Like it's ridiculous, the marketing that's out there, but it's coming. So you've got the mobile networks improving. You've got 5G been rumored for a while. It's coming, but it's not quite there yet. Define like IoT security and OT security. Like where is the convergence? Are they totally separate? Like, cause I think sometimes they do get interchanged and it's not clear, like what's the difference?
So for me, the difference is that the industrial scale, right? Because we do have IIoT as one of the other taglines, which is Industrial Internet of Things, or Industry 4.0, or digital transformation discussions. And it's the same concept, but it's elevated. And so instead of talking about, my HVAC in my home, which would be IoT, I'm talking about a multi-million-dollar refrigeration unit in a plant. They may still have the 5G conversation. They may still have this idea of being able to program everything from an iPad, which scares the bejesus out of me. So the concepts are the same, but the scale is very different. And so when I start talking about things at an industrial scale, that's where the IIoT piece comes in. And that's where you'd find, the Dragoses of the world sort of working through what can we do to prevent a really bad day from happening. IoT side, I would probably put that into a blended area, more so where it would probably sit with IT, but you need to understand the impacts. So for example, what do we consider our data center processes? Our data center HVAC, that may be industrial. Some of these data centers have their own power facilities, have their own sort of industrial refrigeration capabilities, in which case I would put that under OT. But if it's something like our office building or, whether it be elevators, HVAC, anything that could be a 0-1 that moves something in a building, that could be in this weird area where, sure, it could sit within building management, but it probably needs to have some overlay then with IT as well.
Got it. It's interesting. What about let's take it to an industry that everyone kind of knows, like the food service industry. We all go to like fast casual or, there's a lot of technology coming out there with like the food, like food safety and, where's things like we're talking about kind of critical infrastructure when we talk about OT versus IoT, but like for a retail food chain, critical processes are like how safe is the food and how likely is the food to go bad? Like, do you consider that IoT versus like where do you draw the line or does it matter?
So I would say, so we've actually done a lot of work in food and beverage industries, and it's again at the plant level. Where is the food being processed and doing sort of like the crown jewels analysis of what would a really bad day look like in a food processing plant absolutely is safety systems, and not just sort of safety of the food, but also safety of the people working at the plant, because those environments are rough. Like if you've ever been to a chicken processing plant, it is a rough and dirty place to be. And so making sure that, again, we're talking about safety, both from the end use product as well as safety of the people there is where, again, the Dragos conversation would have. That is more like on the, wholesale manufacturing side of the food and bev industry. As we get more into like what's happening at the restaurant floor, that's probably where you see more IoT. And that, again, would probably fit more inside the IT framework of things.
Got it. Really confusing. OT, IoT, IIoT, IT. We should just add some more I's and O's in there, honestly. I mean, just let's keep adding. So, no, thanks for sharing. It's a really fascinating topic. Keith, I'll let you kind of chime in here.
Yeah, sure. I'm curious, where is the IIoT, IAB? Where's the industry going? What do you see coming down the pipe for Dragos in the next year? What is the new technology? What can people get excited about that you're developing and the industry as a whole, the OT cybersecurity industry?
Yeah, so I would say with Dragos in particular, just everyone's seeing that, I would just say, convergence of what we do internally. So again, if you want to be able to have a platform, it's meeting you where you are. Maybe in that journey to the platform, you need services to be able to start you out. Right? Not everybody can, immediately get a technology in some cases, and they want to be able to understand their environment a little more, in which case we leverage our services department. Maybe you just really want to be able to have an instant response retainer. That's one of the great services that we provide is I don't know what a bad day looks like, and I don't have the security expertise in-house to be able to respond. Being able to bring somebody on site from our team to help out is, again, where I see this, the future of the state going is a combination of all of these things. intelligence, response, platform, and being able to have professional services. That's where, Dragos we've been focusing on, and we're going to continue to focus going into the next year. For the industry, I think we actually already tackled the big one, which is this idea of digital transformation and cloud. There's no avoiding it. 20 years ago, we were having a conversation about TCP/IP. And so what does it mean to start connecting substations to each other that were never connected before? And security professionals say, no way, no how. You'll never have TCP/IP in my substation. And they obviously won the debate, which is why we have no TCP/IP. That's not true. We lost the debate really badly because we said from a security perspective, no, not understanding there's a business need for efficiencies that was going to win the debate. Same thing's happening right now with cloud. If any security practitioner out there is saying no to cloud, you're going to lose the debate because we're talking about so much more efficiency. Instead, you have to say yes, and here's how we secure it. And I think that's where we're going to really see the next drivers of things happening. Talk about regulation, electric sector. They're already looking at virtualization and cloud technologies and what that could mean. And I think that's where we're going to see probably the next decade or so really pour out in terms of what we're going to do in the OT space.
It's kind of a very obvious topic. Like we should secure the most critical pieces of our plants, our production lines, et cetera. But it's kind of complex. I mean, it's like you really are getting into the weeds of IT, the weeds of the business processes, technology. One, is it the government's responsibility to continue to pass legislation to like regulate the OT and have requirements around OT security? Like, how do you see that whole piece playing out? And like, do you think we're doing a good job as a nation or as a world, like regulating?
I think some sectors have done better than others. I also think some regions have done better than others. We actually, 2022, I just did a SANS ICS Summit talk on this, but 2022 was the most active year ever for ICS, OT, security, standards, and regulations. It seems like everyone just got hip to it all of a sudden. And so we started seeing activity out of Europe, activity out of Australia, activity across the globe focusing on this problem. I do think that there's some value to a public-private partnership that talks about what should we do? What should be the bare minimum requirements that we should all agree like we can do? But there also needs to be a conversation about, okay, well, how do we actually incentivize that? How do we put that into place? There have been also some really good marks there too. Here in the United States, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission just released an order talking about incentives. So how do we incentivize you being more mature than just the very baseline minimum requirement standards that we have? And I'd be curious to see how that goes. So I think we're still discovering the relationship, even though we've been doing it for so long, in terms of what our strengths and weaknesses for government and private sector. But I do believe that both parties have a sort of spot at the table, as it were.
That's awesome. Jason, running up toward the end of the podcast. And typically toward the end, we like to spend a little time talking about if you had a message that you could broadcast to everyone in the industry, any decision maker of a manufacturing organization, what would that message be? Let's say you had a billboard that everyone could see. What would you say?
So if I were to broadcast a message, it would absolutely be that conversation about how would you know if you are secure and safe in OT? One of the things that we talk about a lot is that if you're not cyber secure in OT, then can you really be cyber safe? And that's this big conversations about, well, again, if I don't know an attacker's there, I send an engineer on site, they're going after the safety systems. As an engineer, I always want to make sure that I'm going to be safe. And so that's absolutely, I'd probably even just shrink it down to, are you cyber safe? And make sure that safety and security are talked about in the same breath when I'm in an industrial plant. If we can go do that, then I think that the cultural issues, the funding issues, hey, is this really important, all sort of go away because we understand that safety and security are going to be the same thing when I'm in an industrial environment.
Hey, Jason, we really appreciate having you on. I guess as we kind of close out, and I think that's great advice for everyone, I guess a follow-up question is, what would you recommend and how do people get in touch with you? Because I think people are going to find a lot of interest in this and question if they've really done enough in this space. What would Dragos, like tell our listeners the best way to kind of start this conversation and kind of frame it pre-meeting with you or someone and like what you recommend?
Yeah. So obviously, www.dragos.com, not only from the perspective of what we have on our website, but we have a lot of free material that we give to the community. ICS security is very small compared to IT security. So we view it as a community effort to be able to provide education where we can, And part of that is actually every year on November 5th, no matter what day of the year that lands on, it could be a Sunday or a Saturday, we host the Dragos Industrial Security Conference, DISC. And it's free for asset owners in the industrial space. So if you don't know where to start with Dragos.com. If you want to get deeper into it, we've got a free conference that we leverage for everybody to be able to attend and just be able to learn a little bit more. You'll be able to hear from us on the research that we do, understanding how it is that we can leverage things like detection or like the professional services or incidents that we've dealt with. And another thing that's really valuable on our website is the year in review. We've been doing a year in review every single year since Dragos has been a company. And that year in review provides you sort of this look back as to the top vulnerabilities, the top threat actors, the top incidents that we've seen. And that should really hopefully get people the right questions that they may need to be able to ask back to their organization. So the hub is Dragos.com, but there's so many avenues that you could pick from there. I just recommend maybe starting with looking at DISC, looking at our free webinars, and looking at what we do in year in review.
Yeah, and we'll link these in the show notes so that if you're listening to this while you're driving and you want these later, look in the show notes. You can also reach out to us at Upcala. We partner with Dragos, and we're big fans of what they're doing in this space. Jason, this has been great. I think it's a really interesting, fascinating topic that's going to become more important. I think it's going to continue to evolve with, like you said, the cloud adoption, et cetera. I know Keith and I are excited to talk to our customers and understand a little bit more about what they're doing. And I think you share a lot of knowledge today that people will find valuable. So thank you for joining. Thank you for being our 13th episode, which could be unlucky, but I think it's lucky. Keith has Santa Claus on his roof, so it's a lucky day for him.
There you go.
Once again, thank you to all the listeners
I have
out there.
compass on my roof.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Keith's got something on his roof. Thank you to all the listeners out there. Continue to subscribe to the podcast, and we look forward to the next episode. So have a great day.
Thank you for having me. Take care.
Bye, guys.
Thanks for listening. The IT Matters podcast is produced by Upcala, an IT advisory firm that helps businesses navigate the vast and complex IT marketplace. Learn more about Upcala at opkalla.com.